I wanted to let you know a little bit about the Better Bozeman Coalition, whose mission is to preserve the unique character of Bozeman's neighborhoods while working with the city on housing affordability, availability, and natural resource sustainability. And we're pleased to bring you Professor Patrick Condon this afternoon. The intent in bringing the professor here is that our community and policymakers may learn valuable lessons about why increasing housing supply through density doesn't result in affordability, something our community needs desperately. The Better Bozeman Coalition is eager for our community and policymakers to learn and implement strategies that do result in affordable housing creation, and Professor Condon has several to share with us this afternoon, several ideas. And by the way, I want to note that there are note cards and pencils for questions, which we encourage. After Mr. Condon's presentation, we will be taking questions from the floor, and I know you'll have many. Excuse me. Patrick Condon has over 25 years of experience in sustainable urban design, first as a professional city planner and then as a teacher and researcher. Patrick started his academic career in 1985 at the University of Minnesota before moving to the University of British Columbia in 1992. After acting as the director of the Landscape Architecture program, he became the James Taylor Chair in Landscape and Livable Environments. In that capacity, he has worked to advance sustainable urban design in scores of jurisdictions in the US, Canada, and Australia. Just a second. After acting as the director, I think I read that. Patrick has also led the Sustainability by Design project by the Design Center for Sustainability. For over 20 years, the Design Center and James Taylor Chair worked on a variety of projects and books to contribute to the healthier and more sustainable urban landscapes. Recognizing the need for collaboration as a fundamental part of designing sustainable communities, Patrick has pioneered public engagement methods. He has successfully focused attention on how to make systemic changes in the way cities are built and operated, notably in his East Clayton project in Surrey, British Columbia. More recently, he and his research partners collaborated with the City of North Vancouver to produce a 100-year plan to make the city carbon neutral by 2107. Patrick and his partners received the Canadian Planners Award for Planning Excellence and the British Columbia Union of Municipalities Award of Excellence for his work. He was educated at the University of Massachusetts and has written several books, including 5 Rules for Tomorrow's Cities, 6 City, 7 Rules for Sustainable Cities. And we do have a few copies of his books if anyone is interested in buying them. So at this point, I'll turn the program over to Mr. Condon.
That's me, UBC Professor Patrick M. Condon, but since you don't know me and I don't know you, I'm going to introduce myself a little bit at the beginning of this. Next slide, Allison. So I'm just a guy from Brockton, Massachusetts, City of Champions, where I grew up, and that's how the city looked in the 1960s. It doesn't look like that anymore. It went through a lot of changes, changes that were in many ways not as favorable as what happened to you. But what that did for me was got me very interested in the attachment that people have for their communities and how that collective attachment can often contribute to the creation of a good community or the lack of an attachment for a bad community. So that's the guy I am. And next, Allison. That has led me into over 40 years now, of working on the question of what makes a sustainable community. The word sustainability is just another word for a good community or an equitable community or a green community, all those things. but particularly an affordable community, as it turns out, because the idea of having a sustainable community that nobody can afford to live in is indeed an oxymoron, right? So that project in the upper right was one that I did, 5,000 units, 10,000 people in Surrey, BC, built on walkable principles based on my book, 7 Rules for Sustainable Communities. I'm quite proud of it. Next, Allison. I'm not a real estate economist. I'm not a theorist. So that's not me. What I am is an empiricist, basically looking at the facts. And my research is about looking at the facts and trying to understand what those facts suggest. So I don't want to overstate or understate my qualifications. Next one. And after that 40 years of working on the question of sustainable communities in the way that I've described, I've come away from that experience within the last 10 to 15 years with a lot of frustration, because what I thought was going to happen sort of automatically, you saw that 5,000 unit new development, that it would be affordable. I thought it would be automatic, that it would be affordable for people making average wages in the region, ordinary wage earning, men and women and their families. And I thought that would my activity would move things in that direction. But for reasons that I'll discuss in a little while, unfortunately, my hopes and dreams for affordability in the areas that I have worked, particularly in the Vancouver, BC region, have not worked out the way I wanted them to work out. And I've concluded it's always, in the end, about the land. Great American tradition, it's always about the land. At the end of the day, it's about the land. So there's a whole set of issues that revolve around land access and who gets access to it, under what government sets of opportunities and restrictions, or basically what's called land rights that are delegated to people who own the land. All those things really are what really drives this question of, is it affordable or is it not? Next, Allison. And with your community, I'm here to tell you, for better or worse, when you have hotels that are advertising a room for $1,000 a night, you may think you're different than Vancouver, British Columbia, but you're not really. You're very similar, because you're both what I and many others call a global city. You've become a place that's very attractive for everybody in the world to want a piece of. And that's really what's happening in your city. And that's what's that is what happened in Vancouver. That is what people like me and 100 other men and women in Vancouver working for those 40 years have brought about unintentionally. And a city that became so attractive for a very large worldwide investment community that no matter what we did, it seemed to lead to higher prices, not lower prices. So that's me, and that's my progress on that, and this is why I'm interested in this question that comes before your city these days. So, next slide, Allison. So it's been mentioned. Thank you for mentioning that. I've written a number of books, and all 4 of the ones on the left are really about how to create a good community. It has to be walkable. The schools have to be nearby. You have to take care of the stormwater so it doesn't pollute the trout streams, all that kind of stuff, in addition to affordability. And again, to repeat myself, unfortunately, is that over the course of that 40 years, I became more and more frustrated, to the point where Broken City, the book that brings me here today, is very, very narrowly focused on affordability and why we can't seem to get it in places like your community, no matter how hard you try. Next slide. And I wrote the book during the pandemic mostly, and I wrote Broken City because I am angry. I'm angry because ordinary wage earners can't afford housing anymore. Basically, looking at the age cohort in the room, we're talking about mostly our sons and daughters, and in many cases our grandkids, can't afford a home anymore. You know, it's a little more complicated than that. A lot of our sons and daughters are able to access what I call the bank of mom and dad to get that six-figure down payment and stuff like that. But essentially, if you don't have access to the bank of mom and dad, you cannot afford to, you can't afford to put a roof over your head easily. You live in what's technically called housing precarity. Next. And that housing precarity is showing up in your community. And this is not unusual. This is what's happening pretty much everywhere that is under the influence of this global investment land rush towards the value of your urban land because it's an attractive location on the planet and a lot of people want a piece of it. And the way it is operating now, it's naturally extruding a whole set of people who you really need in your community. You know, I'm willing to bet that 90% of those people have jobs, that they're getting 15 bucks an hour, hopefully more, but that's not sufficient for them to do other than this lifestyle. You know, you still have a view of the mountains. It doesn't look that bad to me, but my conclusion after all this is it's not the building that costs too much, it's the land under the building that costs too much. And that will be my central message to you, is is there anything you can do about that value? And why it's a question for you as a community is that the community actually creates that value. When you allow somebody to put a 4-story building on a parcel in such and such an area, you have decided that the value of that land is going to change, and it can change very, very substantially. So this is a gift that you are essentially authorized to deploy to whatever sets of benefits. One set of benefits is everybody makes more money. The other set of benefits is housing is affordable. Might be affordable based on how you manage the tools you have available to you, and that's what I'll be talking about, is how we can use planning policy, believe it or not, for the objectives that are under discussion here around affordable housing, affordable to the wage earners who you really need to keep in your community. All right, next. What I'm going to present is the Vancouver example, and now I've just spent a lot of sentences or paragraphs telling you that your community is just like Vancouver, so I hope you hold that in your mind, because it is just like Vancouver as far as I can figure out. And in Vancouver, we had this long 40-year experiment that I was part of adding a whole bunch of new density within existing neighborhoods in a variety of ways, hoping that that would lead to affordable housing for basically the middle class. And all of that started against the background of trying to prevent sprawl and wanting to add density to the center city instead of having it sprawl out into the agricultural landscape. So that was a big part of it. So we thought it was going to work, and next slide. And this is the result. It's this really heroic change over that 50 years in what the city has done. No other North American city, not New York, not Los Angeles, not Toronto, not San Francisco, has come even remotely close to this level of adding density throughout the city. And this image is obviously the most dramatic example of that. That shows the density that was put on the downtown peninsula, which is about 10% of the land area. But that constituted about 45% of the new housing, and the other 55% of the new housing went into secondary suites, lane houses, 4-story mixed-use along the arterials, duplexing over a long period of time. We had supply to fix this affordability problem. We actually tripled the number of housing units citywide since 1970. Just to give you an example, New York City has added about 30%. We've added 200% more housing units during that period. There is no other competitive example. Next slide. We went from a population of 384,000 to 662,000 in 2021, starting in 1961, according to this chart. And then, but we went from 109,000 housing units in 1961 to 315,000 in 2021. In other words, we didn't quite double our population, but we did triple our housing units. And how does that math work out? The math works out because we went from a family size, average median family size, 3.8 individuals in the 1960s to 2.1. So that's where you needed a whole lot more housing units because your families were a whole lot smaller on average. Quite an achievement. Next. Against the background of that achievement, this chart brings you back to 1976. There's a lot of information here. You know, if you're really into data, you can dwell on it for a long time. But the only one from a distance that you need to look at is the brown line, which is the inflation-adjusted wages in our community that have been flat for a couple of lifetimes, against the blue line, the dark blue line, which shows you the ratio between those income levels and the home price. And for all my life, it was supposed to be an order of nature that the housing market in a particular jobs catchment area, call it a metropolitan region if you will, the average house prices would be 4 times greater than the gross income of the median household. So if the median household is $50,000, the house should cost $200,000. And that held true until roughly the 1990s throughout the world, throughout the United States, throughout Canada, throughout Australia. But it looks like that was the exception rather than the rule. And people like Thomas Piketty, who wrote a great book called Capital in the 21st Century, explains that during this very narrow period between the end of World War II and basically now, we went from a position where the middle class was able to access the asset of this housing stock, if you will, with their ordinary wages. But that is no longer the case because the housing stock, and basically by housing stock, I really mean the land underneath the housing stock. That land has become an asset class much more than it is now based on its commodity value. The value of that land is now based on its asset value globally, and that asset value is appreciating, particularly in places like your city or in Vancouver. So now the ratio between average salaries and Vancouver is like it went from 4, that ratio in 1976, to what is about 17 or 18 now. So it's obviously not affordable. Next. So that raises the question of adding new density, new supply, brought down prices. Vancouver should have the cheapest housing in North America. It has the most expensive housing in North America when you measure based on the gap between median household income on average and the entry level or the median price for the average home. It is by that measure, it is the most expensive housing in North America and the 3rd most expensive in the world, only behind Hong Kong and Sydney. After all of our trying as hard as we could to add supply. Next. Yeah. Why didn't it work? It's, according to the theory, should have worked. If housing prices are too high, there must not be enough of them. Why didn't it work? Next slide. The argument that I'm presenting for you today is this is why. What happened to us, and what appears to be happening here to you, is that this is just an example with big numbers that are easy to get your head around. Before rezoning a piece of land, the land price might be $1 million. That means the per square foot interior price that the market is allowing is 1,000, which is basically what your market has right now. And you would think that quadrupling the density of that parcel would lead to a drop of that per square foot interior price, because the land component of the final purchase price should have been diluted by the fact that you've added the density. Unfortunately, what we find is that after rezoning, the land price goes up to $4 million in this case, while the per square foot of an interior building, condo or a detached building, it doesn't matter, stays about the same. Because what's being bought by the global economy here is, it is about land, but it's about location, and the coin of the realm is a square foot of interior space on the market, and your market is now about $1,000 a square foot for a new product, up to $1,500 in some cases. So we find that it does not dilute the price to add density. Here's two very simple examples. We have the luxury of our assessment records are available in a form that shows the land value, which is in the blue, and the building value, which is in the green. And the top one shows you essentially a detached single-family type building, and the bottom one shows you a much higher density. But what's interesting here is the ratio between the land value and the building value does not dilute. It stays about the same. Next slide, Allison. The ratio stays the same even though the numbers are different. So the single-family home land value is basically $3 million. The higher density one is over 10 times more at $40 million. So what's happening here in your community is, according to people I've talked to, the same phenomenon is taking place. You add allowable density in the hopes of getting affordability, and you're surprised to find out that this 500 square foot so-called one-bedroom unit is still selling for $500,000 because it's $1,000 a square foot. And the way to think about that is that the developer often captures that increment between the building value and the land value, but often it's another class of individual, which is a land speculator. And a lot of developers actually make most of their profit through land speculation. So it's hard to tease out these figures. So I hope you appreciate the value of me showing you this. Next. What can you do? Vancouver has a good example of what was done. We're sort of losing our skill in this, but during our heyday, when me and others were really pleased with what was going on, we were leveraging new development to create social benefit. And there was a specific formula that said, okay, your land value is $1 million at current zoning. At the new zoning, we're talking about the land value is going to be $10 million. We know that. You agree, right? We're going to ask for 80% of that new land value, and you can have 20%. So the landowner in this case, went from the land value being $1 million to $2 million, but the city got the other $8 million eventually after the whole thing sold out. And with that $8 million of what we call land lift, we were able to do a number of things, such as a truly incredible urban park system, unmatched. We're all very proud of it. And it was financed by land lift in the context of a rezoning, just by asking for it as essentially an impact fee. In the United States, this is usually referred to as an impact fee. I think it's a more accurate way to think about it when you think about it as land lift. The community has lifted the value of land. In return, we would like to have some community benefit paid for with a portion of that land lift. And the measure was 80%. And that produced the park system. Next. That produced a series of community centers and daycare centers and school sites. Next. Most importantly was affordable housing. sometimes in the form of co-ops, sometimes as direct city-owned social housing, sometimes in the form of non-governmental organizations, private nonprofit corporations whose mission it is to provide affordable housing. There's a number of different models, all done with land lift. Next. That's the Vancouver example. At the other end of the spectrum, that's actually sort of a tax. What I've described as a land lift can be construed in the American circumstance as a tax based on, you know, the legal record or the decisions of a state legislature or that kind of thing. So sometimes that won't work, sometimes it will. Depends on what kind of impacts are legal in your state to ask to assign to a new development, and whether or not you can have things that go beyond sewer pipes, water pipes, school sites and playgrounds. Can you go one step further into affordable housing, which California does because they have a very specific mechanism that they said by allowing this development for all these rich people, it's going to produce a need for X amount of wage earners. So they need to be accommodated. But that's one thing. This does the same thing. It captures land value for social benefit, but in a different way. What they did in the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts, was to say, all right, what would happen if we allowed the whole city, we're going to double the density, the allowed density in the whole city with a stroke of a pen, but what we're going to require is the new building be affordable. And they have a formula for affordability. It has to do with a various breakdown relative to your wages and so forth. But the idea was that any high-density building would be 100% affordable, and it would be affordable for a long time. Now, how does that work out without taxpayer subsidy? The way it works out without taxpayer subsidy is by making that, by saying, you can have this affordable housing overlay. If you don't want to use it, go ahead and use the existing zoning, you know? But if you want this other avenue, then here are the requirements. So the value of the parcel stays leveled at its worth for existing zoning, right? But when you double the allowable density, under ordinary market circumstances, you're going to double the land price. But under this circumstance, it's going to mitigate that rise and perhaps even eliminate it. So that's the whole idea. It ends up being land value that would have gone to either the land speculator or the developer, and eventually ends up as equity for the buyers. But that doesn't solve your affordability problem. Next slide. What's particularly important, I mean, I consider myself an urban designer and think of urban design as a way of creating all these social and ecological benefits. What's particularly important about the Cambridge example is, you know, when you go into somebody's neighborhood and you say you're going to double the density tomorrow, a lot of times people are not going to like that. And that was true in the case of Cambridge. But what the city did, which worked out in time, was they went out into the neighborhoods and showed people that the building typologies that were going to be promoted, there's not a better word to use than fit in. They were historically appropriate building types, familiar, quality additions to a neighborhood that seemed to be a good addition to that neighborhood. Which turned out to be it wasn't that people didn't want affordable housing in their neighborhoods. A lot of it was they just didn't want to see some kind of institutional thing that looked like a prison go into their neighborhood, which is what they thought it would be. Next. So here's an example of an extreme situation where they preserved the Victorian era house on the front of the lot, and then where the garden used to be, that's where the rest of it is. And what you're looking at is a 100% affordable project in Cambridge, Massachusetts that will be affordable in perpetuity. It's really important for me to note that there are a million ways to do non-market housing. It can be a co-op, it can be a non-governmental organization, it can be a community land trust. There's a lot of other ways to do it. But unfortunately, my message to you is I've concluded reluctantly that the market is not ever going to deliver affordability. You know, you have to find another way to get to affordability. And I like this one because it doesn't take the money out of the taxpayer's pocket. It prevents money that would have gone into the land speculator's pocket from ending up there instead. Next. So now we're at your town, and this has the benefit of like 20 minutes of me thinking about this after our tour. So this is on the north side of the city area that we look through. And this is a very common situation. And today we talked a lot about, at least I became very interested in a very simple possibility for your community, which is to not allow new land assembly, not allow these parcels. Next slide. Not allow these very uniform parcel sizes, which were subdivided a million years ago, to be assembled into a half-block long thing. One of the real disruptive features of what's going on now are the buildings are of a type that require almost a full block of parcels to be assembled, which is another land inflationary activity. And also because the buildings are of that size, they tend to operate within the financial streams of global financing. So the developer needs to get assurance that in our community, it's all about pre-sales. You have to pre-sale 45%. Your project has to be at least $20 million, otherwise the financial entities for your financing loans are not going to give you the money. So there's a whole kind of global industry that moves the situation towards bigness and also towards building pro forma. That means average wage earners will not be able to afford it. So that's kind of the parcel situation. I just threw together an idea of us just to demonstrate in real terms stacked townhouse typology on these small lots. If you allowed party wall construction, which you already have in your downtown community, that's the nature of American downtowns. Anyway, next slide. So what that building typology, I'm not presenting this as architecturally magnificent. It's basically spec housing, but what's different about it compared to what you have now coming in, next slide, is that it fits on small lots. It doesn't require assembly because you can have party wall construction where the red line is. That indicates that you can do these one at a time, and it happens more incrementally within the patterning, the parcelization that's common to your city. And when you build out in concert with that parcelization, it automatically prevents what results from having this dramatic departure in character and in form from what it has replaced. See, it's very simple. And the little arrows here are also, I threw those in as an important element because what you see every place the arrow is a private renter or owner has access to the sidewalk, which makes them as a construction type affordable because you don't need a central corridor and you don't need an elevator necessarily. And it puts all those people with a relationship to the street, which is very much what your existing city is like when you move out into the residential areas. So this only is a demonstration that you can get these high densities without the kind of disruption that you're looking at now. But in the end and in conclusion, next slide, my take-home message is don't just upzone hoping for affordability because you won't get it. Upzone insisting on affordability because you can. It's legal. It's been tested through the Supreme Court. It's not a illegal taking. It legally sits under the idea of the police powers that are ordinarily the tools of municipal government. And municipal government has a constitutionally protected obligation, really, to make decisions based on the health, safety, and welfare of the community. And that obligation is often in contrast to the other, I think it's the Fifth Amendment that says no property seizure without just compensation. So those two things, those two constitutionally grounded positions are often where you have to do your argument. You have to do good policy. It has to be justified, but if it's justified, if you make the case that the health, safety, and welfare of this community requires this kind of thinking about zoning, requiring affordability as a condition of upzoning. Basically, the simple term for that is density bonusing, but there are other ways to do it, like an affordable housing overlay. Then I recommend that you think about doing it. So I will leave it at that. Thank you, Allison, for inviting me. Thanks, everybody, for your attention.
So I mentioned when we did the introduction that there were cards for questions. If anyone has one, would you please raise your hand so that we can come by and pick them up?
But according to open source data, 80% of Vancouver is still zoned for single detached housing. That 80%, which is referenced as often erroneously as single detached housing, now those are 3,300 square foot lots, and they allow 4 dwelling units per lot. So that ends up being between 40 and 60 dwelling units per acre, which is townhouse density. If they are bought for single-family home use, and that does happen from time to time, that 2.23 million is really, again, land value, and the land value has the land value, as I showed in the chart, has been increasing over time, even in the absence of a rezoning, so that the assumption of the land market is that there is additional saleable density available. Well, I'm sorry. How can you argue that zoning reform was tried and failed? I can't do more than what I just said. There's more in the book about that. But our assumption was that, adding density would lead to affordability and got it up to a tripling of the number of housing units. And unfortunately, the empirical evidence is that, sadly, it didn't work. And I'm not arguing in favor of single detached housing at all. That's completely the opposite of what I'm arguing.
Your policy suggestions could be used to oppose height, density, and parking reductions. Are you opposed to these things? Please elaborate. Is density bad?
I need to read it because I can't.
Sure.
Density is good. I hope I made that clear. My whole career has been about adding density above what is considered typical North American density, like that East Clayton project out in the middle suburb, the second suburb ring of Surrey. It had 3 dwelling units per parcel in an area on parcels that were 3,000 square feet instead of 5,000 square feet. So it was at least 3 times more dense than the normal condition. And one of the reasons why we wanted to do that was because there were 2 rental units and the owned unit. And the rental units were a way for the owner of the whole 3 units to afford it, because the rents coming in from those 2 secondary suites, is what we call them up there, was capable of bridging the gap between the income of the the one who wanted to own the home, and what their wages were capable of affording. I call that the ecological, the ecology of the social ecology of the parcel is what we used to call that. Next.
What will be the effect on land prices if the restrictions are not permanent?
Well, in the case of Cambridge, the restrictions are permanent. So the presumption of the model that Cambridge adopted was that land price increases would be mitigated if you required affordability as a consequence of the affordable housing overlay. It does not mean that the land prices will never go up, because as median wages go up, and let's hope that they do, so too would the land value would pencil out at a higher level.
These two are very similar, so I'm going to read them both and give them to you. With many tools not available to us in Montana, what do you suggest we do to create more affordable housing in our community? It says, I understand that Montana state laws prohibit cities from requiring affordable housing. It may be optional for the developer.
Yeah, I've had that conversation with people here. You know, there are prohibitions on in demanding that something be done. So that's like that's like inclusionary zoning. Sometimes comes under that axe because it's viewed as a taking. But the affordable housing overlay is legally different because it's not a taking. It's the city is saying, do the normal thing with your land. Your land is still just as valuable as it was, but if you want to do this other thing, you can if it's affordable. So it gives a second avenue for approval that benefits entities such as nonprofit housing providers who are in the game of doing that kind of housing, but are blocked from making the numbers work because the land prices are too high. If you just double the density allowed, and they have to compete with the market, projects are not going to pencil out.
Yeah, it's really getting to me because a lot in my neighborhood sold for $435,000, a lot. My question is about the use of affordable overlays, density bonuses. You discuss applying these tools in large global cities. In a context where there is ample land and close substitutes in nearby towns and underdeveloped areas, do you think your proposed policies could encourage sprawl? Sprawl question.
Well, actually, no. The question, the core of it is, what do you do if you don't have a whole bunch of land? The Cambridge example is a very small geographic city, which basically it's about the size in acres as your city. And I think there's only 100,000 people in it, so it's a good example where that size community went and just put the affordable housing overlay over the whole city. It's legally possible for you to do a portion of your city, but that's why I like the model, because it deals with the land price issue, I think, effectively.
We are facing a water crisis. Any intervention ideas to address this? Thank you for your study and insights.
I need to read it. Yeah, that would be a longer conversation. I mean, so On water, I won't. I mean, there is, that's a whole different avenue of a conversation about, is there in fact freshwater resources in your region? And usually when a community is growing, lo and behold, people find a way to get the water to it if the economics work out. So the history of these kinds of limits impeding the growth of a community are not generally encouraging, but in extreme circumstances, a lack of availability of water can be a legal way of preventing additional density.
I think we're seeing that in the Phoenix area. Montana State University can swamp the city by adding 500 to 1,000 additional students in 1 year. MSU houses primarily freshmen. How should the city cope? Students band together and outbid working people. I'll give you this and I'll do that.
Yeah, well, it's a related issue, and it's showed up in the Vancouver region because our universities are not doing their part to take advantage of the land that they have available to them to build housing for students. So we're getting some of that swamping that is occurring and adding to the wide variety of elements that are increasing our land prices. But this is just one factor. Mortgage rates is another factor. Global investment is another factor. Immigration is another factor. The pied-à-terres, weekend homes is another factor. But it all comes down to land value at the end. That's why I focus on land value, because at least in my simple mind, it simplifies the whole thing, and it does show up as all of those different strands of influence do show up are made manifest in land price inflation.
Well, this one may be a bit related then. Even in increased density, prices have remained high. Someone buys at this price. Why? What role does the marked income disparity play in this unaffordable housing problem? Marked income, the income disparity.
Well, you have a global market for your square foot of interior space. That's what's being sold here. And the global market has decided your center city is a great place, which maybe was not the attitude of the market 30, 40 years ago. That's happening in a lot of places these last 2 decades, not just in Vancouver and not just here, that the asset value of really nice places and beautiful landscapes is going up and up. Because if you have 10 million to invest, and I hope you do, the best thing to invest in is, your land, your own land, because it's done way better in the last number of decades than stocks or bonds or even Bitcoin for that matter. So that's kind of what drives it up. And unless you can figure out a way to capture that land value somehow through assigning some kind of opportunity rather than an obligation. You say, community, you have an opportunity to, instead of having 2 floors, have 4 floors. Instead of having a floor surface ratio FSR 0.8, go up to 2.7. You have an opportunity. We're offering you this opportunity. Do you want it? Because the opportunity exists if you're willing to do affordable housing. And you have to show us that housing will be affordable.
Here's a great one we all love. What do you do about parking?
I remember one of my teachers said, any place that doesn't have a parking problem has a problem. Beyond that, I don't know. I think often not having parking, saying you don't need to have parking, is based on an erroneous assumption that will make housing cheaper. But what it probably will make land more expensive, because what you save building the building gets absorbed in an increased price for the land, if you accept my hypothesis, which is the whole thing is all about the value of that per square foot of interior space.
I know we're all worried about community and what happens to community when you have infill and density.
Yeah, well, you know, it's the essential question, right? That's why I sort of tried to end not just talking about land price inflation and the Cambridge model, but kind of looking at the nature of your existing city. And in my view, the block and the parcel configuration that's there now is the sine qua non of your character. And I would hope there's an opportunity for you to say, we want density, but there is no real good reason. And in fact, there's a lot of negative reasons for it to be these big half-block building sizes. And if you just work within the parcels, it's much more likely that some of the inflationary effects on land value will be mitigated, because assembling a whole block of single-family homes is an inflator. I don't know if any of you are getting knocks on your door from people who are offering, you know, money for your house because they want to assemble your block. I mean, they're offering good money, you know, because when they do their pro forma for that building out there, they can afford $600 a square foot for buildable value. But that's a whole different model than the model which says this parcel gradually transforms over the course of a number of decades into something that is what we design professionals call typologically compatible for a number of reasons with the surrounding. In other words, density done well is what the bottom line would be. But that doesn't solve your affordability problem.
Nope, and that's the next question. You focused on affordability from the perspective of prospective home buyers. What about renters? Will we be changing into a society like in Europe, where most people expect to rent housing and never own their own homes?
Yeah, I might make the radical position that the only difference between rental and owned is that the landlord gets the equity of the rental, but the numbers have to work out the same way. So the whole financial envelope for a rental has to be more or less equivalent to the financial envelope for a condominium project. So that's the difference. Now there's a huge social advantage of having a number of rental units in your community, because there's a lot of people who it's not appropriate for them to be buying a house at whatever particular stage in life they're at. Hopefully it's available at a price they can afford. But the way the market is operating now, you might be getting some proposals for all rental building. We're getting tons of them in Vancouver. And that's because, again, the global real estate market has started to shift somewhat away from condominium as the best financial return model to a more enduring kind of equity builder or asset builder, which is what rental is. And for a number of decades, the condo was the much preferred financial model around the world, but now the rental is starting to compete with it. And what that really means is the rents are necessarily going to be pretty close to the cost of the equivalent condo minus the equity gain, which is going to the landlord.
Whoops. This one is a pretty common question around here. Many of our properties are purchased by very wealthy individuals or corporations who will not reside full-time in these properties. Doesn't that make prices rise automatically, pricing out median wage earners and ability to purchase?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is another way of saying exactly the same thing that I said, that when you become attractive to the global market, and you're attractive because it's clear that your property is going to be appreciating at between 5 and 10% a year into the infinite future, that is distorting your market for local wage earners. That's moving the market away from local wage earners. The good news is that when you have that kind of enthusiasm from the global real estate investment community, that is something you can leverage, because I looked at the list, and the per square foot prices for the new stuff is basically between $1,000 and $1,200 a square foot. I can predict a year and a half it'll be $2,000 a square foot. That is just a lot of money that people are willing to pay for very small units, which can be leveraged if you do the pro forma in such a way that additional density that you allow actually leverages affordability. Like for Vancouver, for example, given that we have a very similar situation, I'm saying to people, it would be really easy for us to insist on 50% of all new housing units provided by the market would be designated as affordable, and maybe those condominium units would go to a nonprofit society. A million ways to do that too. 50% is possible because we have this investment energy. If you're in a community where there's no investment energy, you have a whole separate set of problems. That's, a decline in real estate values. I mean, my hometown of Brockton went through the opposite problem that you have. So it might be useful to think, yeah, we've got hundreds of millions of dollars coming into this community from other parts of the world, basically. That's an opportunity for leverage.
So this person is asking, are you saying incentives like extra height and parking are a great way to get affordable housing?
I'm saying that if you just give extra height and not ask for anything back, and you remove parking requirements and not ask for anything back, you're not going to get affordable housing. I'm sorry. You're just not. Because it's going to be, when the product is on the market, it's still going to be worth $1,000 a square foot as a condo or the equivalent rent. They're not going to rent it or sell it for less than the market. So it's a giveaway to the project, and more often than not, it's a giveaway to whoever is lucky enough to have the land when all this is taking place.
What are creative examples you have seen to create the subsidy required and to make homes affordable in high-cost communities?
Precious few. That's why I talk about Cambridge. That's the best. California has a number of localities, municipalities that have struggled to get affordability as a requirement. They've worked it through the courts. They've had successes and failures, so there's maybe 8 or 9 different versions of density bonusing and or inclusionary zoning and or impact statements that require affordable housing in California. So those are useful, but those are good. But I also say that even within the context of the state of Massachusetts, the only one that's doing it right, I think, is Cambridge.
Here's an interesting one. Even as Bozeman grows and developers cash in, taxpayers are being asked for more money for a community center, a pool, and increased police and fire capacity. How can Bozeman get these new developments to pay for these increased basic services needs? It's a good question.
Yeah, well, what really happens in communities like yours is when you get your tax assessment in your bungalow, the same house you've been living in for 50 years, your assessment goes, from 100,000 to 500,000 in a relatively short amount of time. That's because you're in the impact zone of this new upzoning opportunity. So they're charging, the assessment is based on the assumption of highest and best use. And if you're lucky enough to have a parcel that's got a new highest and best use, and you see that your assessed value has gone way up and you can't afford the taxes, I hate to say it, but the best thing to do is to sell out and move to Florida. I mean, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. But that does impel people to make that kind of decision, driven by these kinds of questions, is the inequity that you're willing to, you and your parcel that you've been on for 40, 50 years are willing to go along the way you've always gone along. But when these new, hugely more valuable projects come nearby, that has a ground zero effect on your assessed value. And as your assessed value goes up, you might be inequitably being charged for ordinary improvements.
And this question is similar to that. How can retired homeowners on fixed income be protected from the tax liability of rising values? Maybe a different kind of question.
Yeah, I think maybe you have some of this. A lot of communities defer taxes until the point of sale, so that's probably legal for you to do if you wanted to do it. But that's rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic a little bit, because you're mitigating the consequence of this land price inflation through that reassessment or that forgiving of that particular tax.
How did Vancouver implement the land lift?
Yeah, we were lucky enough to have a major downtown with a lot of available space that was transforming from industrial to residential. The picture I showed of all those new towers, the first wave of them were on industrial land, so we had a lot of land available that was owned by a relatively small number of parcel holders. So it was possible for the city to individually negotiate the land lift with the support of professional assessors who could say what that new value was in a sort of transparent exercise. That was how the land lift one worked. That one is a little more complicated than the Cambridge one, but that is how that one worked.
In 2023, the City of Spokane approved pro-housing reform. Though it is a recent change, there has been very little difference in home value trends. Why do you think this is?
Yeah, well, I believe that the Spokane example conforms to what I generally say is true. When you have allowed the new density, you become surprised that the price of the new stuff, even though you might have a duplex or a threeplex on the same land that's sold for $1.5 million, and each duplex goes for $1.8 million. So it's very surprising. But that again comes back to my point. What's really happening if you add allowable density like Spokane is doing, in the absence of some kind of social benefit negotiation, if you just give it away for free, the benefit, which is driven by the per square foot value of that new product, which is globally arrived at, if you will, in many places, Spokane marginally one of them, then your best efforts are in vain.
Yeah. Incentives. This question is related to historical preservation. Your slide of the Victorian home did not excite me. Is there a place for a zoned-in area for historical homes, etc.?
Well, yeah, I mean, you have historical districts and they're already pretty well regulated. So what I'm talking about is a little bit different than that. If you have a citywide problem of affordability and you're wrestling with how to solve it, it ends up being a choice between two positions. The solution must be that we don't have enough housing. There's a limit on supply. So we need more supply, and that would reduce housing prices. And the other position, which is the position I'm presenting, is that's not true. It doesn't work. It doesn't work because land price inflates and it makes the projects impossible to pencil out at affordable rates. Your whole market is elevating as a consequence of the thing you're trying to do to lower prices, weirdly, is dramatically increasing the real estate value of your community, and most of that new value is tied up in the value of the land, which has always been there.
It is. Do you know how zoning changes for tiny houses can impact affordability, benefit landowners, help pay taxes, and create affordable housing for essential workers, family? That's all one.
Yeah, I mean, I like tiny houses. And you know, your city is a great place for tiny houses. They'd be beautiful. And I've been involved in some projects for tiny houses. But if they go into the market, they're going to go into the market at $1,500 a square foot. And it's not going to be affordable to your sons and daughters unless you do something else. Do tiny houses plus a requirement. I don't know. I mean, I've given some examples. You've got smart people in this community, and it's beautiful, and you have a great base to look from. So instituting a collective understanding of how to solve these problems without destroying the community, with a clear-eyed view of the financial tsunami that's really sweeping over your city, and coming up with some idea what to do about it. That's a more complicated endeavor, but as a civic activity, I can think of nothing more interesting and more important.
Montana statute required that at least duplexes everywhere also prohibits the imposition of any design requirements not applicable to senior single-family dwellings. Therefore, none of the design sensitivity you describe. Suggestions?
Well, you know, you're up against it. I mean, I'm here. I'm lucky I get to leave tomorrow, but you know, I don't have to fight this fight tomorrow. But you know, your state is going in the opposite direction of what I'm suggesting. This question speaks to state decisions that have been grounded in the idea that the reason why housing is not affordable is because local democracy is standing in the way of it. And if we could just get rid of regulation, if we could deregulate city development, everything would be okay. That's the politics which is suggested here. Now, unfortunately, it's not going to work. I'm here to tell you it's not going to work. But nobody's going to know that for 30 or 40 years from now, you know, because that's how long it takes to rebuild a city. And and that's why I come here telling you the Vancouver story. We tried it. We tried it. It didn't work.
It's true, and those politicians will be gone in 30, 40 years too. Just to sum up, how is the affordable housing overlay different than inclusionary zoning?
They're different names for the same thing. I mean, inclusionary zoning or affordable housing overlay or capitalizing on land lift, they're basically all the same thing. They take money that would have gone to land speculation or the land portion of the development in profit and stream it not necessarily into the overstuffed pockets of the land speculators. They're doing fine, and they would continue to do fine in the context of you saying, yeah, well, yeah, but, you know, we actually, here's the thing, nobody really owns land What you own are the rights to land. And you can sell those rights. But you got to remember, the rights are government delegated. And that's what zoning is. It's a delegation of rights. So it's a limit and an opportunity. Land is very special. It's not like your car. It's not a commodity. You own your car, but you get rights to your land. And those rights are delegated by local authority. Now, your state authorities appear to have taken the position that they want to give additional rights to all that land, and they think that there will be social benefit for allowing these new rights and getting rid of local democratic decision-making in the planning realm. But I'm here to say that that's not going to work. I mean, a lot of different places, that same argument. The same argument in BC, same argument in California, same argument in New Jersey. It's everywhere. So this attitude of what your state is doing is not unfamiliar to me. But I'm, again, here to say, sorry, that's not really... You've basically lost an opportunity. What the state has just done is probably added a couple $100,000 to the value of any 4,000 square foot parcel in your city overnight. Good for you. I hope you enjoy it.
And this is going to be the final question for this evening. I know Professor Condon's going to be standing around, so I'm sure, and signing books, because we have some books to sell. So I'm sure he'll be able to answer other questions on an individual basis. What would you suggest for Bozeman's affordable housing situation after a brief overview of our community?
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay. Yeah, well, my two recommendations are very limited parcel assembly beyond basically anywhere. Stick with your existing parcels. Very simple. It's within the municipal authority. You can do that tomorrow. And then beyond that, if you take seriously what I'm talking about, you have to come up with some strategy, and I recommend the Cambridge one. As a condition of additional new zoning authority, you expect social benefit in return. And it appears to me the social benefit that you're in most of need of is housing that's affordable to your wage-earning families, particularly families that are younger than most of the people I see in this room. Otherwise, you become the Monaco of the far west, right? Of the Great Basin.
The Monaco.
The Mountain West, yeah.
Do you have any final words? For the Better Bozeman Coalition, I'd like to thank you all for coming and attending this event. I hope that you've learned something and that you can take back with you. And I know I have. Land is the bottom line, and we need to be having the developers help with us providing this, providing housing to our city instead of giving them benefits.